My name is Rebecca Hayes, 32, and I still remember how the winter air stung my face as Andrew threw my belongings onto our front lawn. His mother Eleanor stood watching, calling me a financial burden and failure. I quietly packed a small suitcase, appearing defeated as I walked away from the 5-year marriage. They had no idea I was worth $21 million, or that I'd been planning my exit for months. Their cruel rejection just accelerated my timeline. If you're watching this and have ever felt underestimated by the people who should support you most, you're not alone. I'm sharing my story from Seattle today, but I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your location in the comments, and if this story of family betrayal and sweet karma resonates with you, hit that subscribe button to join our community of survivors who refuse to be defined by others. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. I grew up in a small Midwest town called Mapleton, raised by my single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. We never had much, but Mom instilled in me the values of education and independence. Through her sacrifices and my determination, I earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University, where I studied computer science. That's where I met Andrew Sullivan during my sophomore year. He was handsome, charming, and came from a wealthy Boston family with connections stretching back generations. The Sullivans owned a chain of luxury hotels across New England and had the kind of old money that bought not just comfort but influence. When Andrew first asked me out for coffee, I couldn't believe someone from his world would be interested in me. "You're different from the other girls here," he told me on our 3rd date. "You're not entitled. You understand the value of hard work." I took it as a compliment then. I didn't recognize it as the first red flag, his way of separating me from his kind while simultaneously putting other women down. I was too blinded by his attention and the way he seemed to admire my academic achievements. Our relationship progressed quickly. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. But looking back, I can see how Andrew established control early on. When we went out, he always paid, brushing aside my offers to split the bill. "My father would disown me if he knew I let a lady pay," he'd say with a laugh. But this generosity came with strings. Andrew expected to know how I spent my money, even the little I had. He'd casually ask to see my student budget spreadsheet, offering advice that felt more like scrutiny. When I bought a new laptop for my programming courses, he questioned if I really needed such an expensive model. "I'm just looking out for you, Becca," he'd say. "You don't have the luxury of making financial mistakes." After graduation, Andrew proposed with a Sullivan family heirloom ring. I said yes, swept up in what I thought was a fairy tale. That's when I first met his family at their estate in Beacon Hill. The Sullivan mansion was intimidating, a 4-story brownstone filled with antiques and portraits of stern-looking ancestors. Eleanor Sullivan, Andrew's mother, greeted me with a cool assessment. "So you're the scholarship girl," she said, instead of hello. "Andrew tells us you're quite clever." Throughout that weekend, Eleanor peppered me with questions about my family background, each one designed to highlight the gulf between our worlds. "And what did you say your father did before he left?" she asked over dinner, fully aware my father had abandoned us when I was 3. Richard Sullivan, Andrew's father, barely acknowledged my existence except to ask about my career plans. "Tech startups? That's a risky path," he commented when I mentioned my job offer from Innovate Tech. "Wouldn't you be better off with something more stable? Perhaps in administration." Andrew's sisters, Patricia and Laura, were no better. They spoke around me rather than to me, discussing their exclusive club memberships and mutual friends from boarding school. When I mentioned growing up in Mapleton, Patricia asked if that was somewhere near a city people would know. Our wedding the following year was lavish by my standards but modest, according to Eleanor. The Sullivan family took control of every detail, from the guest list, mostly their connections, to my dress, which Eleanor insisted on helping choose. My mother sat uncomfortably at the ceremony, outnumbered by Sullivan relatives who barely spoke to her. After the honeymoon, we moved into a beautiful colonial home in Cambridge. The house was technically in both our names, but Andrew's parents had provided the down payment, a fact I was reminded of whenever I suggested redecorating or making changes. "Mother thinks we should keep the original fixtures. They're period appropriate, Andrew would say, or, Dad thinks that renovation would hurt the home's value. I found a job at Horizon Tech, a promising startup developing educational software. I was excited about the work and the potential, but Andrew and his family consistently undermined my career. Isn't that cute? Eleanor said at a family dinner when I mentioned a successful project launch. Playing with computers while Andrew does the real work at Sullivan Hotels. When I received my first promotion to project manager, Andrew's response was tepid. That's nice, but don't get too caught up in it. Those tech companies fold all the time. I tried to bridge the class divide, to fit into their world while maintaining my identity. I attended their charity galas and country club events, enduring the subtle jabs about my background. I invited them to my company's launch parties and tried to explain the importance of my work, but they remained dismissive. I'm sure it's very interesting, Richard would say, before changing the subject to Andrew's latest achievement at the family business. The class differences became more pronounced as time went on. Andrew insisted on separate finances beyond our joint household account. He drove a Mercedes while I kept my practical Honda. He belonged to an exclusive golf club but questioned my modest gym membership fee. We need to be careful with expenses, he'd say, despite our comfortable income. You never know when your company might have another round of layoffs. I was working hard, contributing to our household and building my career. But in the Sullivan world, I was still the charity case, the girl who'd been lucky enough to marry up. And every day, they made sure I knew it. 2 years into our marriage, I received a call that would change everything. My mother's voice was shaking on the phone. Your Uncle William passed away last night, she said. Uncle William was my father's brother, a distant figure I'd met only a handful of times. He'd left the family behind decades ago to pursue his dreams in Silicon Valley. We'd exchanged Christmas cards and occasional emails, but he was hardly a presence in my life. There's something else, Mom continued. His lawyer called. William wanted you to be the beneficiary of his estate. I expected perhaps a few personal items or maybe a small savings account. I was completely unprepared for what the lawyer, Thomas Jenkins, revealed during our meeting the following week. Ms. Hayes, your uncle was one of the early investors in Cloud Core Technologies, he explained. His shares in the company, along with his other investments and properties, amount to approximately $21 million. I sat in stunned silence, the document in front of me blurring as tears filled my eyes. Uncle William had left me a fortune, more money than I could comprehend. My first instinct was to call Andrew to share this life-changing news with my husband. That evening, I arrived home early to prepare a special dinner and tell him. But as I approached our bedroom to change clothes, I overheard Andrew on the phone with his mother. Of course I know what I married, Mother, he was saying, his voice carrying that tone of aristocratic annoyance he used when speaking about me to his family. Yes, she's beneath us socially, but she's smart and presentable enough. And she's grateful, which makes her easy to manage. I froze in the hallway, my hand over my mouth to stifle any sound. No, she knows her place, he continued. Besides, can you imagine if I'd married someone like Heather Blackwell? I'd never hear the end of her family connections. At least with Rebecca, I'm the one with all the power. In that moment, everything shifted. The inheritance no longer felt just like money. It represented freedom, power, and choice. I quietly retreated downstairs, made a quick excuse about a work emergency, and left the house. I drove aimlessly for hours, thinking about the past 2 years of my marriage. Every dismissive comment, every time Andrew or his family had made me feel small, every moment I'd compromised my worth to fit into their world. I realized that telling Andrew about the inheritance would only change how they treated me, not how they saw me. I would still be the outsider, just a useful one now. That night, I made a decision that would guide the next phase of my life. I would keep my inheritance secret while planning an exit strategy. The next day, I contacted Janet Miller, a financial advisor recommended by Uncle William's lawyer. We met at a coffee shop far from Cambridge, where there was no chance of running into anyone from Andrew's circle. I need complete discretion, I told her after explaining my situation. My husband and his family can't know about this. Janet nodded understandingly. Unfortunately, your situation isn't uncommon. We'll create a strategic plan that protects your assets. Over the next few months, Janet helped me establish offshore accounts and investment structures that couldn't be easily traced. We moved most of the inheritance into diversified investments under an LLC with no obvious connection to me. I kept detailed records of every transaction, building a financial fortress Andrew couldn't penetrate. At the same time, I began methodically documenting the emotional and financial control in my marriage. I started a password-protected digital journal where I recorded incidents with timestamps, direct quotes, and context. I saved emails, text messages, and even recorded some conversations when legally permissible in Massachusetts. "You're being paranoid," Andrew said one evening when he noticed me taking notes after a particularly unpleasant dinner with his parents. "What are you writing?" "Just work ideas," I lied smoothly. "A new project management system I'm developing." He lost interest immediately, as he always did when the topic was my career. I began building a network outside of Andrew's influence. I reconnected with college friends he deemed not our sort. I joined professional organizations and started attending networking events, always explaining to Andrew that these were necessary for career advancement. Through one of these connections, I met Sofia Garcia, a real estate agent who helped me purchase a modest but beautiful apartment in Cambridge under my LLC. I furnished it minimally but comfortably, creating a sanctuary Andrew knew nothing about. "The market is perfect for investment properties right now," Sofia told me as she handed over the keys. "And this neighborhood is only going to appreciate." I kept working at Horizon Tech, continuing to live modestly despite my hidden wealth. I contributed my regular salary to our household expenses while my millions grew through Janet's expert management. I began quietly removing sentimental items from our home, photographs, jewelry from my mother, mementos that couldn't be replaced. I stored them in my secret apartment, along with copies of important documents. "Have you seen my graduation watch?" Andrew asked once, referring to a gift from his grandfather. "It's probably at the jeweler's for cleaning," I suggested, knowing perfectly well it was safe in his dresser drawer. I was careful to only remove my own possessions, nothing that belonged to him. I created a new identity infrastructure, separate email accounts, a new phone, a private mailing address. I established credit in my maiden name and built relationships with professionals Andrew didn't know, a different doctor, dentist, even hairstylist. Throughout this planning period, the emotional reality of my marriage became increasingly clear. I wasn't preparing to leave because of the money. I was leaving because my marriage had been built on inequality and control from the beginning. The inheritance just gave me options many women in my situation didn't have. "You're different lately," Andrew commented one evening. "More confident. Is something happening at work?" "Just growing into my role," I replied with a small smile, thinking of the investment portfolio that now exceeded $23 million thanks to Janet's management. I kept a physical diary as well, stored in a safe deposit box Andrew didn't know about. In it, I documented every financial and emotional slight. Eleanor's comment about my discount store dress at the country club, Richard's dismissal of my promotion. Andrew's insistence that I account for every dollar I spent while he purchased a $30,000 watch without discussion. Just because we come from different backgrounds doesn't mean we can't understand each other, I told Andrew early in our marriage. "Of course, darling," he'd replied patronizingly. "That's why I'm teaching you how things work in our world." Now I understood that our world would never truly include me as an equal. But with each passing day, as my exit fund grew and my plans solidified, I felt a growing sense of power. I could leave any time I chose. That knowledge helped me endure the subtle humiliations and control tactics that had become routine in my life with the Sullivans. I was no longer trapped. I was simply waiting for the right moment. 18 months into my secret planning, the tech industry experienced a significant downturn. Several major companies announced layoffs, and venture capital funding dried up overnight. Horizon Tech, despite our innovative products and growing user base, wasn't immune. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," My boss Neil said during a private meeting. We're reducing staff by 30%, and your position has been eliminated. You've been an incredible asset to the team, and I'll personally write you an outstanding recommendation. I was genuinely disappointed. Despite preparing for my eventual departure from my marriage, I had loved my job and believed in our mission to make education more accessible through technology. But I accepted the news with grace, knowing I had financial security most of my colleagues didn't. When I told Andrew about the layoff that evening, his reaction was immediate and cold. "Didn't I warn you about startups?" he said, not even looking up from his phone. "This is exactly why I told you to consider something more stable at Sullivan Hotels." "I'm already reaching out to my network," I explained. "The job market is tough right now, but with my experience at a failed company," he interrupted. Not exactly a selling point. The following weeks revealed the true nature of my marriage and my place in the Sullivan family. Andrew became increasingly distant and financially restrictive. He removed my access to our joint credit card without warning. "It's just temporary," he explained when I discovered the card was declined while grocery shopping. "We need to be careful with expenses now that you're not contributing." I was still contributing my unemployment benefits to our household account, but that wasn't enough for Andrew. He began scrutinizing every purchase I made, questioning the necessity of basic items like shampoo or running shoes. "Do you really need the brand name?" he'd ask. "There are cheaper alternatives." This from a man who wouldn't consider wearing anything but custom-tailored suits. The real humiliation came during a family dinner at the Sullivan Mansion. Eleanor had invited us, along with Patricia and her husband Bradley, and Laura with her fiancé James. What I didn't realize was that I was the main topic on the agenda. "Rebecca," Eleanor said as the housekeeper cleared the main course, "Andrew tells us you've been between positions for nearly a month now." Her tone made my unemployment sound both deliberate and shameful. "The tech industry is going through a correction period," I explained. "Many qualified people are looking for work right now. Perhaps it's time to consider whether that industry is right for someone with your background," Richard suggested. "There's no shame in administrative work. Or retail," Patricia added with false helpfulness. "My friend manages the Neiman Marcus downtown, and they're always looking for sales associates." I felt Andrew stiffen beside me. He was embarrassed, not by his family's rudeness, but by having a wife who wasn't employed. "Rebecca understands she needs to find something quickly," he said, as if I weren't sitting right there. "We've discussed a timeline." This was news to me. We had discussed no such thing. The Christmas gathering at the Sullivan estate 2 weeks later was even worse. Extended family members I barely knew felt entitled to comment on my employment status. "Still looking, dear?" Andrew's Aunt Margaret asked loudly across the living room. "Have you tried the community college? They often need office help." Throughout the evening, I overheard conversations about my failure in the tech world, as if losing a job during an industry-wide downturn was a personal deficiency rather than economic reality. When we returned home that night, Andrew delivered his ultimatum. "You have 30 days to find a job," he stated flatly.
"Any job.
"Or you'll need to make other living arrangements." "You're giving me an ultimatum about our marriage based on employment?" I asked, stunned despite everything I'd endured. "This isn't about our marriage," he said dismissively. "It's about expectations. The Sullivans don't carry dead weight." The next day, Patricia and Laura took me to lunch under the guise of sisterly support. Their true purpose quickly became clear. "We think it might be best if you go back to, where was it? Mapleton?" Laura suggested between sips of her $18 cocktail. "You're just not fitting in here," Patricia added. "And it's creating tension for everyone, especially for Andrew," Laura continued. "He has a position to maintain in Boston society." I smiled thinly. "And I'm damaging that position?" "Well, yes," Patricia said bluntly. "The unemployed scholarship wife isn't exactly helping his image." That evening, while looking for a document on our shared home computer, I discovered a folder labeled Rebecca Expenses. Opening it revealed years of spreadsheets tracking every purchase I'd made since our marriage began. Andrew had been monitoring my spending in meticulous detail, categorizing each item as necessary or frivolous, with notes about whether he approved. Next to a $43 birthday gift I'd bought for my mother 2 years earlier, he'd written, "Unnecessary. Could have spent less." The invasion of privacy was stunning, but it was the pettiness that truly revealed who my husband was. Our final argument came after a particularly demoralizing day of job rejections. I'd applied to over 50 positions in 2 weeks, securing only 3 interviews that hadn't progressed. "Maybe you're not presenting yourself well," Andrew suggested. "Or maybe potential employers can sense your lack of drive." "I built a department from the ground up at Horizon," I countered. "I'm extremely qualified." "And yet here you are," he said coldly. "Unemployed and increasingly worthless to this household." The word worthless hung in the air between us. "Is that how you see me?" I asked quietly. "As a financial asset that's no longer performing?" "Don't be dramatic," he said. "I married you because I saw potential. But potential without results is just disappointment." I nodded slowly, a strange calm settling over me. "I understand perfectly now." I began subtly accelerating my exit plan while outwardly appearing increasingly desperate. I took calls from recruiters in Andrew's presence, making sure he overheard my pleading tone. I left job search websites open on our shared computer. I cut back on everything, wearing the same few outfits and skipping haircuts. The performance worked. Andrew and his family were convinced I was on the verge of a breakdown, exactly where they wanted me, dependent and frightened. Richard Sullivan called me to his study during another family dinner. "Andrew tells me things are difficult," he said without preamble. "I'm doing my best to find work," I replied, eyes downcast in the submissive posture they expected. "Yes, well, effort isn't always enough," he said. "Given the circumstances, we think it would be prudent for you to sign this post-nuptial agreement." He slid a document across his mahogany desk. The terms were breathtaking in their cruelty. In the event of a divorce, I would receive a one-time payment of $10,000 and waive all rights to any shared property or future support. "Just a precaution," Richard said, noting my expression. "For Andrew's protection." I took the document, promising to review it, knowing I would never sign away my rights. My own legal team was already preparing for what was coming. The final straw came during what I later termed the family tribunal. Eleanor invited us to dinner, but when we arrived, the entire Sullivan clan was assembled in the formal living room: Richard, Eleanor, Patricia, Laura, and their husbands. "We've been discussing your situation," Eleanor announced once I was seated. "And we've collectively decided you're simply not Sullivan material." "You tried," Patricia said with fake sympathy. "But some people just aren't meant for our world." "Andrew deserves someone who enhances his position, not diminishes it," Laura added. I looked at my husband, waiting for him to defend me, to reject this coordinated attack. Instead, he stared at his hands. "I've given you chances," he finally said. "More than most would." In that moment, I knew it was time to execute the final phase of my plan. The Sullivans had shown me exactly who they were, and I believed them. The eviction happened on a Tuesday morning. I'd been staying with a college friend for a few days after the family tribunal, giving Andrew time to consider our future, as I diplomatically phrased it. In reality, I was making final preparations for my new life. When I returned to collect more of my belongings, Andrew was waiting. He'd changed the security code, so I had to ring the doorbell to my own home. "I've made my decision," he announced as soon as I stepped inside. "This isn't working." Without further explanation, he began gathering my things from our bedroom, tossing clothes and personal items into suitcases with little care for what might break. "Andrew, can we discuss this reasonably?" I asked, maintaining the facade of the desperate wife while documenting everything with the voice recorder app secretly running on my phone. "There's nothing to discuss," he said coldly. "You've had months to find employment. You've failed. The Sullivans don't accept failure." I noticed his mother's car pulling into our driveway. Eleanor had come to supervise my removal from the family, like an exterminator called to eliminate a pest. "You have 30 minutes to get your things and leave," Andrew continued, dragging a suitcase downstairs and toward the front door. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, allowing my voice to tremble. "That's not my concern anymore," he replied. Eleanor entered without knocking, surveying the scene with grim satisfaction. "Don't forget the gardening tools in the shed," she told Andrew. I believe she bought those with the household account. What followed was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life, and yet, strangely empowering. Andrew began throwing my belongings onto the front lawn while Eleanor directed the process, like a conductor leading an orchestra of cruelty. Neighbors peered from windows and slowed their cars as they drove past, witnessing my public shaming. "The financial burden ends today," Eleanor announced loud enough for anyone passing to hear. We gave her every opportunity to prove herself worthy of the Sullivan name. I stood quietly, watching as books I loved, clothes I'd carefully saved for, and mementos from my life before Andrew landed on the damp grass. I made no move to gather them, which seemed to frustrate both Andrew and Eleanor. They wanted tears, begging, a scene that would confirm I was as pathetic as they believed. Instead, I calmly took out my phone and called Sophia. "It's happening," I said simply. "Yes, right now. Could you come with your car?" "Thank you." I disconnected and faced my husband and mother-in-law. "I'll take what I can carry now," I said evenly. "My friend will help with the rest." "Friend?" Eleanor scoffed. "I wasn't aware you had any left." I just smiled slightly and began selecting the most important items from the lawn, placing them carefully in my small suitcase. The dignified response clearly unsettled them both. "You should be thanking us," Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly. "Andrew supported you far longer than most men would have." I continued sorting through my possessions in silence. "The house keys," Andrew demanded, holding out his hand. I removed the house key from my keyring and placed it in his palm. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Andrew," I said quietly. His expression flickered with momentary uncertainty. The first crack in his armor of entitlement. Sophia arrived 20 minutes later, her SUV pulling up to the curb. She took in the scene with wide eyes but composed herself quickly. "Let's get you sorted," she said, helping me gather the remaining items from the lawn. Eleanor watched suspiciously. "Who is this?" "A friend," I replied simply. "From where?" she pressed. "From a life beyond the Sullivans," I answered, loading the last of my belongings into Sophia's car. As we drove away, I caught a final glimpse of Andrew and Eleanor in the rearview mirror. They stood side by side on the manicured lawn of what had been my home, looking strangely diminished. "Are you okay?" Sophia asked as we turned the corner. "I will be," I replied. And for the first time in years, I truly believed it. I'm not going to pretend that day wasn't devastating. Having your life thrown onto a lawn while neighbors watch is something that stays with you. As we drove away from what I thought was my home, I felt a strange mix of grief and freedom washing over me. Have you ever experienced that moment when something painful happens but you know deep down it's also setting you free? Let me know in the comments if you've had your own turning point moment. Sometimes our worst days become the catalyst for our best chapters. The aftermath of the eviction unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. Andrew immediately froze our joint checking account and canceled the credit card that was in my name but linked to his account. He changed all the passwords to our shared digital services and redirected our mail to a P.O. box I couldn't access. His texts oscillated between self-righteousness and threats. "You brought this on yourself," one message read. "If you'd just found a job like a normal person, none of this would have happened." And later, "My lawyer says you'll get nothing in the divorce. Nothing. Hope your pride was worth it." I didn't respond to any of them, saving each as evidence for what was to come. Meanwhile, the Sullivan family began their campaign to control the narrative. Patricia called our mutual friends, telling them I'd had some kind of breakdown after losing my job. Laura suggested to members of our social circle that there might have been substance abuse issues involved. Eleanor told the neighbors I had emotional problems that made it impossible for Andrew to continue the marriage. From my pre-purchased apartment, now fully furnished and ready for full-time occupancy, I watched their machinations with detached interest. Their stories contradicted each other, and grew more elaborate with each telling, revealing more about the Sullivans than about me. I activated the next phase of my plan, meeting with Diane Foster, a high-powered divorce attorney known for her meticulous preparation and uncompromising style. Based on what you've told me and the evidence you've gathered, we have a strong case for financial abuse, Diane said after reviewing my documentation. But are you sure you want to proceed this way? You could simply reveal your assets and negotiate from a position of power immediately. I'm sure, I replied. Let them believe I'm destitute a little longer. I want to see exactly how far they're willing to go. Diane nodded, understanding my strategy. We'll let them make the first legal move, then. But in the meantime, continue documenting everything. I followed her advice, maintaining a detailed record of every communication from Andrew and his family. I watched from a distance as they constructed an elaborate fiction about our marriage and its end. A story in which I was alternately unstable, gold-digging, incompetent, and manipulative. What they didn't know was that I was methodically building a case that would eventually expose the truth about who had really been manipulated. I used my secret phone to call my mother, explaining what had happened and assuring her I was safe and financially secure. I knew something wasn't right with that family, she said. The way they looked through me at your wedding. But Rebecca, are you sure about keeping your inheritance secret? It seems like so much unnecessary suffering. It's not about the money anymore, Mom, I explained. It's about seeing them for who they truly are, without the mask they wear when something valuable is at stake. She understood. My mother had raised me to value truth over comfort, integrity over convenience. The path I'd chosen wasn't easy, but it was honest. In my new apartment, away from the crushing weight of Sullivan expectations, I began to rediscover parts of myself that had been suppressed during my marriage. I reconnected with friends Andrew had deemed inappropriate. I applied to positions that excited me rather than those that would impress his family. I even started consulting for a small educational technology firm, working remotely and on my own terms. Each day, without the Sullivans' constant judgment, felt like removing another layer of armor I'd been forced to wear. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I stopped second-guessing my every decision, word, and purchase. And all the while, I waited for Andrew to make his next move, knowing that patience was now my greatest advantage. 3 weeks after the eviction, Andrew's divorce petition arrived via courier. The document was exactly what I'd expected: allegations that I had abandoned the marriage, claims that I had made no significant contributions to our household, and a settlement offer of $5,000 despite my failure to uphold marital obligations. He's being generous, the accompanying letter from his lawyer Thomas Blackwell stated. Given the circumstances, Mr. Sullivan could pursue costs for support provided during your extended unemployment. I forwarded everything to Diane without comment. She called within the hour. They're overplaying their hand, she said, a note of satisfaction in her voice. The abandonment claim is particularly bold considering we have photographic evidence and witness statements about the eviction. What's our next move? I asked. We respond with a straightforward counterpetition. No mention of your assets yet. Let's see how they handle being challenged at all. Diane's strategy was perfect. My counterpetition simply stated the facts of the eviction and requested an equitable division of marital assets, including the house that was in both our names. We made no extravagant claims, no emotional accusations, just a calm assertion of my legal rights. Andrew's response was immediate and furious. He called repeatedly, leaving increasingly agitated voicemails. What the hell are you playing at? His first message demanded, you know that house is mine. My family paid for it. And later, your equitable division is a joke. You brought nothing to this marriage. I saved each message and sent the recordings to Diane without ever responding directly to Andrew. Thomas Blackwell called next, his tone professionally menacing. Ms. Hayes, I advise you to reconsider your position. The Sullivans are not a family you want to engage in legal battles. They have resources you cannot imagine. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Blackwell, I replied calmly. Please direct all further communication to my attorney. The Sullivans were used to intimidation working. They were used to people backing down in the face of their wealth and connections. My refusal to be intimidated clearly unsettled them. As the discovery process began, Andrew's legal team requested extensive financial documentation from me: bank statements, investment accounts, credit card records. Clearly expecting to find evidence of hidden support from my mother or friends that they could use against me. My official financial disclosure showed exactly what they expected: my unemployment benefits, a modest savings account containing about $8,000, and credit card debt of approximately $3,000 that had accumulated since the eviction. All of it was technically true. These were the accounts in my legal name that were not held by my LLC or offshore structures. Meanwhile, Diane requested comprehensive documentation of Andrew's finances, including his stake in Sullivan Hotels and any trust funds or family investments benefiting him. This request was met with immediate resistance. "These requests are overly broad and designed to harass our client," Blackwell responded. "Mr. Sullivan's family holdings are not relevant to this proceeding." Diane's reply was masterful: "Any assets providing support or income to Mr. Sullivan during the marriage are relevant to determining equitable distribution. If Mr. Sullivan wishes to claim these assets are separate from marital property, he bears the burden of proving that separation." What followed was a legal ballet of requests, objections, and strategic disclosures. Andrew's team tried to characterize me as financially irresponsible, producing the spreadsheets he'd kept monitoring my spending, inadvertently proving my claims of financial control and surveillance. They argued the house was effectively a gift from the Sullivan family, despite my name on the deed. They attempted to devalue my contributions to the marriage by dismissing my career as hobbyist employment. Throughout this process, I maintained my composure and the secret of my wealth. In public, I dressed modestly and drove my old Honda. I took on additional consulting work that provided a legitimate explanation for my ability to pay Diane's considerable fees. As the case progressed, Andrew's settlement offers gradually increased, from $5,000 to $15,000, then to $25,000 with the condition that I waive all claims to the house and any future support. "They're getting nervous," Diane observed. "They expected you to crumble under pressure, not mount a coherent legal defense." The breaking point came during a mediation session 6 months into the proceedings. Andrew arrived with his parents and Thomas Blackwell, all exuding confidence that this would be the day I finally accepted defeat. I arrived with only Diane, wearing a simple but professional dress that gave no hint of my financial situation. "Let's get this resolved today," Blackwell began. "My client is prepared to be generous despite the circumstances." "We're listening," Diane replied noncommittally. $50,000, Andrew stated, as if bestowing a great favor. "Plus, Rebecca can keep her car and personal belongings. In exchange, she relinquishes all claims to the house and any other marital assets." Eleanor nodded approvingly at her son's magnanimity. "That's your idea of generous?" Diane asked mildly. "It's more than fair considering she contributed nothing to the acquisition of those assets," Richard interjected. "Except her name on the deed, her income to household expenses for 5 years, and her labor in making a home," Diane countered. "Labor?" Eleanor scoffed. "We had weekly cleaning service. Rebecca barely knew how to properly set a formal table when Andrew married her." I remained silent, watching the dynamic I'd lived with for years now playing out for Diane and the mediator to witness. "This is our final offer," Andrew stated firmly. "Take it, or we go to court where you'll get much less." I glanced at Diane, who gave me a subtle nod. "Before we respond to your offer," she said, "we'd like to address some discrepancies in Mr. Sullivan's financial disclosures." She produced a folder containing documentation of offshore accounts and investments Andrew had failed to disclose, accounts I had never known about during our marriage, but that my financial team had discovered during their investigations. "These accounts show approximately $3.2 million in assets not included in your financial statement," Diane continued. "Which raises questions about what else might be missing from your disclosures." The color drained from Andrew's face. Richard leaned forward, whispering urgently to Blackwell. "Where did you get these documents?" Blackwell demanded. "Through legal discovery methods," Diane replied smoothly. "We also have questions about the valuation of Mr. Sullivan's ownership stake in the family business, which appears to be substantially underreported." The mediator, who had been quietly observing until now, cleared his throat. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Blackwell. If there have been intentional omissions in financial disclosures, the court takes such matters very seriously." The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The Sullivans, who had arrived expecting to dictate terms from a position of absolute power, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. "We'll need to review these claims," Blackwell said stiffly. "I suggest we adjourn for today." "One more thing before we conclude," Diane said. "My client is prepared to move forward with a forensic accounting of all Sullivan family assets that may constitute marital property. Given what we've already uncovered independently, I believe this would be quite illuminating for the court." It was a masterful threat, one that would expose not just Andrew's hidden assets but potentially the entire Sullivan family's financial structures to outside scrutiny. As we left the mediation room, I caught Andrew staring at me with a mixture of fury and confusion. He had never imagined I could be a worthy opponent. He had never seen me clearly at all. The courthouse was crowded on the morning of our final hearing. After the failed mediation, settlement negotiations had completely broken down. Andrew and his family had shifted from dismissive to hostile, refusing further meaningful discussion. "We'll let the judge decide," Blackwell had declared confidently. What the Sullivans didn't know was that this was exactly what I had been waiting for, a public forum where the truth could be fully revealed. I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, dressed in a Chanel suit I'd purchased specifically for this day. My hair was professionally styled, my makeup subtle but flawless. The transformation from the desperate, unemployed woman they'd thrown out 6 months earlier was striking. I watched Andrew's face as I walked into the courtroom. He did a visible double-take, clearly thrown by my appearance. Eleanor narrowed her eyes, leaning over to whisper something to Richard, who frowned deeply. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Marilyn Hernandez entered. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and intolerance for games in her courtroom, exactly the judge we had hoped would be assigned to our case. The proceedings began with opening statements from both attorneys. Blackwell painted me as an opportunist who had married Andrew for his money and was now seeking an undeserved windfall despite contributing nothing to the marriage. Diane listened patiently, making occasional notes, but showing no reaction to the character assassination. When her turn came, she stood calmly. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about fairness and contribution, but not in the way Mr. Blackwell has characterized it. Today, we will present evidence of systematic financial abuse, deliberate misrepresentation, and a coordinated effort to deprive Ms. Hayes of her legal rights in this divorce. But perhaps most importantly, we will correct the record about Ms. Hayes's financial status, which has been intentionally misrepresented throughout these proceedings." Judge Hernandez nodded. "Proceed with your first witness, Ms. Foster." "The plaintiff calls Rebecca Hayes," Diane announced. I took the stand and was sworn in. Through Diane's careful questioning, I recounted the history of my marriage, the control, the belittling, the monitoring of my expenses. I described the eviction in calm, factual terms, occasionally referring to the documentation we had submitted to the court. "Ms. Hayes," Diane said, "Mr. Sullivan and his family have repeatedly characterized you as financially dependent on him throughout the marriage. Was that an accurate representation?" "No," I replied clearly. "I contributed my full salary to our household expenses from the beginning of our marriage until I lost my job during industry-wide layoffs." "And after losing your job at Horizon Tech, what was your financial situation?" This was the moment we had prepared for, the revelation that would change everything. "At the time I lost my job at Horizon Tech, I had a net worth of approximately $21 million, I stated. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Andrew's mouth literally fell open. Eleanor gripped Richard's arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. Judge Hernandez banged her gavel. "Order," she commanded, then looked at me with unconcealed surprise. "Ms. Hayes, could you clarify that statement?" Yes, Your Honor. 2 years before the events leading to our separation, I inherited $21 million from my uncle, William Hayes, who was an early investor in cloud core technologies. I chose not to disclose this inheritance to my husband after overhearing him tell his mother he had married beneath him and that I was easy to manage because I was grateful. I saw Andrew flinch at hearing his own words quoted back to him. This inheritance was maintained in accounts and investment structures legally separate from marital assets. I continued. I have provided complete documentation to the court. Diane approached with a thick folder. Your Honor, this contains Ms. Hayes's full financial disclosure, including the structure of her inheritance and its current valuation of approximately $27 million. Judge Hernandez accepted the folder, glancing through the first few pages with raised eyebrows. She looked at Blackwell. Counselor, were you aware of this information? No, Your Honor, he replied stiffly. This is the first we're hearing of this alleged inheritance. It's been verified by 3 independent financial institutions, Diane interjected, as documented on pages 8 through 17. The questioning continued as Diane methodically built our case. I testified about Andrew's secret monitoring of my expenses, the family's coordinated effort to pressure me after my job loss, and the public humiliation of the eviction. Throughout my testimony, I maintained eye contact with Judge Hernandez, speaking clearly and unemotionally. But I was acutely aware of the Sullivans' reactions, Andrew's growing paleness, Eleanor's tight-lipped fury, Richard's increasingly concerned whispers to Blackwell. When Blackwell cross-examined me, he attempted to portray my concealment of the inheritance as evidence of dishonesty and manipulation. If you were so wealthy, Ms. Hayes, why continue the charade of searching for employment? Why not simply tell your husband the truth? I wanted to be valued for who I was, not what I owned, I replied simply. When I lost my job, I saw clearly that the Sullivans only valued financial contribution and status. Their treatment of me when they thought I had nothing revealed their true character. So you admit to deliberately deceiving your husband? Blackwell pressed. I admit to protecting myself from a family that had shown me repeatedly that they saw me as nothing more than a transaction, I replied. A family that threw me out of my home and publicly humiliated me for the crime of losing a job during an industry-wide downturn. As the hearing progressed, Diane called Sophia to testify about the eviction she had witnessed. We presented the recordings of Andrew's threatening voicemails, the documentation of his financial monitoring, and statements from former colleagues at Horizon Tech about my professional accomplishments that the Sullivans had consistently dismissed. During a brief recess, I overheard Eleanor being escorted from the courtroom after an outburst directed at her son. How could you not know? $21 million under your nose. When court resumed, Judge Hernandez addressed both parties directly. I've reviewed the evidence presented and find several aspects of this case deeply troubling, she began. Mr. Sullivan, the documented pattern of financial control and emotional manipulation you exhibited toward your wife constitutes a clear case of financial abuse. The coordinated effort by your family to pressure Ms. Hayes during a period of vulnerability shows a disturbing lack of basic decency. Andrew stared at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. Furthermore, the judge continued, your failure to disclose significant assets during these proceedings raises serious questions about your credibility. The court takes a very dim view of parties who attempt to hide assets during divorce proceedings. Judge Hernandez turned to me. Ms. Hayes, while I understand your reasons for concealing your inheritance, given the circumstances you've described and documented, full financial disclosure is expected from both parties in divorce proceedings. However, as these funds were inherited and kept completely separate from marital assets, they remain your separate property under Massachusetts law. She then delivered her ruling. I was awarded full ownership of my inheritance as separate property, half the value of the Cambridge house, and a portion of the marital assets Andrew had attempted to hide. Additionally, Judge Hernandez ordered Andrew to pay my legal fees given his demonstrated bad faith in financial disclosures and attempts to deprive the defendant of her legal rights. As we left the courtroom, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. The marriage I had once believed in was officially over, ended not just by Andrew's cruelty, but by the fundamental dishonesty at its core. "Congratulations," Diane said, shaking my hand. It's not often we get to see justice this complete. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered. News of a $27 million revelation in divorce court had spread quickly. I declined to comment, walking calmly to my waiting car while cameras flashed around me. Andrew attempted to approach me in the parking lot, his expression a confusing mix of anger and something that might have been regret. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. "Everything would have been different." "That's exactly why I didn't tell you," I replied. "I needed to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing." I got into my car and drove away, leaving Andrew standing alone, much as he had left me 6 months earlier. In the weeks that followed, I executed the final phase of my plan. Using a portion of my inheritance, I purchased controlling interest in Innovate Tech, a direct competitor to the Sullivan Hotel's new digital booking platform. With my background in educational technology, I led a team that revolutionized how Innovate Tech approached the hospitality market, quickly outpacing the Sullivan platform and securing contracts with major hotel chains worldwide. It wasn't long before Andrew began reaching out, his messages evolving from angry accusations to awkward attempts at reconciliation. "I miss you," he texted 3 months after the divorce was finalized. "I think we should talk about what happened. I've changed." And later, "I never should have listened to my family. It was always you and me against the world. Remember?" I never responded. Instead, I focused on building my new life and using my resources to help others who had experienced similar situations. I established the Financial Independence Foundation, providing education and resources to victims of financial abuse. When the Boston Business Journal ran a feature on the foundation, Eleanor Sullivan attempted to contact me, claiming she had always seen potential in me and had been misunderstood during our conflict. I declined her invitation to lunch through my assistant. The sweetest revenge wasn't the legal victory or even the business success that now threatened the Sullivan family's dominance in their industry. It was the knowledge that I had finally seen them and myself clearly and had found the strength to walk away. 1 year after the courthouse revelation, my life had transformed in ways I could never have imagined during my marriage. My apartment in Cambridge had been replaced by a penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor, not because I needed the space or luxury, but because I wanted the daily reminder that I was no longer constrained by others' expectations or judgments. Innovate Tech had grown exponentially under my leadership, expanding beyond hospitality into educational technology. Combining my passion for education with my business acumen, I'd hired several former colleagues from Horizon Tech who had also been affected by the layoffs, creating a collaborative environment where innovation thrived. Janet Miller remained my financial advisor and had become a close friend. Sophia Garcia and Diane Foster completed what I jokingly called my Freedom Council, women who had supported me through the darkest period of my life and now celebrated my success. To Rebecca, Janet toasted during our monthly dinner, who turned lemons not just into lemonade, but into a lemonade empire. I laughed, but the sentiment touched me deeply. I had not just survived. I had flourished. Meanwhile, the Sullivan family business was struggling. After losing key contracts to Innovate Tech, they had been forced to restructure. Industry rumors suggested they were considering selling some of their smaller properties to generate capital. Richard had stepped back from day-to-day operations, leaving Andrew to manage the growing crisis. I took no pleasure in their difficulties. Revenge had never been my goal. I had simply built something successful based on my own talents and vision, without the constraints the Sullivans had placed on me for so long. Andrew's attempts to contact me continued, growing increasingly desperate as his professional challenges mounted. 6 months after the divorce, he sent a lengthy email that revealed more than I think he intended. "I never saw you," he wrote. "Not really. I was so caught up in what my family expected, in maintaining the Sullivan legacy, that I missed who you actually were. By the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late. I know you'll never forgive me, but I needed you to know that I understand now. I see you." I read the emails several times, but never replied. His belated recognition couldn't undo the years of subtle cruelty and dismissal. Some bridges, once burned, cannot and should not be rebuilt. My personal life had also blossomed in unexpected ways. Through a charity auction for my foundation, I met Michael Brennan, a pediatric surgeon with a dry wit and complete disinterest in wealth or status. Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's work and passions. "How do you do it?" he asked one evening as we walked along the harbor. "Run a major company, manage a foundation, and still find time to read 3 books a week." "Freedom," I replied simply. "When you're not spending energy trying to make yourself smaller to fit someone else's expectations, you have a lot more time and creativity." He nodded, understanding perfectly without needing further explanation. That was one of the things I valued most about Michael. He never required me to justify my experiences or feelings. Approximately 9 months after the divorce, I encountered Patricia Sullivan at a charity gala for Boston Children's Hospital. I was there representing my foundation, which had recently established a program helping families navigate the financial challenges of long-term pediatric care. Patricia approached me during the cocktail hour, champagne flute in hand and a practiced smile on her face. "Rebecca, it's been too long," she exclaimed as if we had parted on the best of terms. "You look absolutely stunning." "Thank you, Patricia," I replied politely, but without warmth. "We must catch up properly," she continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I've always said you were the smartest of all of us. Between you and me, I never agreed with how things were handled." The revision of history was breathtaking in its audacity. This was the same woman who had suggested I go back to where I came from less than a year earlier. "That's not how I remember it," I said calmly. "Oh, you know family dynamics," she said with a dismissive wave. "One has to present a united front. But I always thought you were special." "How is Andrew?" I asked, changing the subject. Her smile faltered slightly. "Managing. The hotel business is so competitive these days." "It certainly is," I agreed mildly. "Perhaps you two should talk," she suggested, revealing her true purpose. "Water under the bridge, and all that. He's not the same person he was." "Neither am I," I replied. "Please excuse me. I see my foundation director trying to get my attention." As I walked away, I felt Patricia's eyes on my back, and new reports of our encounter would reach Eleanor and Andrew before the night was over. The Sullivans were nothing if not efficient in their communications when it served their interests. A month later, I received an invitation to coffee from Eleanor herself. The handwritten note on Sullivan Hotel's stationery was a masterpiece of strategic humility. "I believe there have been misunderstandings that would benefit from direct conversation," she wrote. "I've always valued your intelligence and drive, and would appreciate the opportunity to clear the air between us." I declined through my assistant, citing scheduling conflicts. The truth was simpler. There was nothing to be gained from reopening that chapter of my life. The final divorce settlement was executed 11 months after the courthouse revelation. Andrew received the Cambridge house, but had to buy out my half at market value. The hidden assets we had uncovered were divided according to Massachusetts law. My inheritance remained untouched as my separate property. The day after the settlement was completed, I purchased a historic building on Beacon Street, just 3 blocks from the Sullivan family mansion. The property had been on the market for months, its asking price too high for most buyers in the current economic climate. I paid the full amount without negotiation. Within 6 months, I had converted the building into the Hayes Center for Financial Empowerment, a residential facility providing temporary housing, counseling, and career support for women leaving financially abusive relationships. The center offered legal assistance, financial literacy classes, and a supportive community for women rebuilding their lives. The center's location was not an accident. I wanted the Sullivan family to see, every day, the tangible result of their actions, not as a taunt, but as a reminder that cruelty often creates its own antidote. At the center's opening gala, I gave a speech that made no mention of my personal experience, but spoke to the broader issue of financial abuse in relationships across all economic levels. Financial independence isn't just about money, I told the assembled donors and community members. It's about agency, the freedom to make choices based on your own values rather than fear or coercion. The Boston Globe covered the event with a front-page story in their Sunday edition, including a photograph of me cutting the ribbon. I later heard that Andrew had been seen purchasing multiple copies of the paper. As the one-year anniversary of the divorce approached, I received word through mutual acquaintances that Andrew's position within his family had deteriorated significantly. The failure of the Sullivan digital platform, directly attributable to competition from Innovate Tech, had been blamed squarely on his leadership. Richard had come out of semi-retirement to advise on major decisions, effectively demoting his son. Eleanor, I was told, frequently referenced my success in criticizing Andrew. She managed to build an empire in a year, she reportedly said during a family dinner. What's your excuse? The final scene of this chapter of my life occurred at the Massachusetts Technology Council's annual awards ceremony. Innovate Tech was receiving recognition for our innovative approach to educational applications in the hospitality industry. As CEO, I would be accepting the award and giving a brief speech. What I didn't know until I arrived was that the Sullivan family had purchased a table near the front of the ballroom. Andrew, Richard, and Eleanor sat stiffly in their formal attire, watching as I took the stage to thunderous applause. From the podium, I spoke about innovation, collaboration, and the importance of diverse perspectives in technology. I thanked my team for their brilliant work and dedication. I made no reference to the Sullivans or my past connection to them. But as I concluded my remarks, I allowed myself to make eye contact with Andrew for the first time since the courthouse. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of regret, anger, and perhaps a grudging respect. Success isn't measured by what you accumulate, I said, addressing the entire room but aware of the Sullivans' focused attention. It's measured by what you create, who you help, and how authentically you live your values. Sometimes losing everything shows you exactly what you're capable of gaining. The applause was immediate and sustained. As I left the stage, I felt a profound sense of closure. The chapter was finally complete. Later that evening, as Michael and I celebrated with my team, he asked if seeing the Sullivans had been difficult. Not difficult, I reflected. Just strange. They look exactly the same, but I see them so differently now. And how do you see yourself? He asked. I considered the question carefully. As someone who found her way home to herself, I replied, after a very long detour. I've learned so much on this journey, from being someone's worthless wife to building a life I'm proud of. The greatest revenge wasn't the money or success. It was rediscovering my own worth and using my experience to help others. If my story has touched you or reminds you of your own journey to self-worth, please share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one and find strength in our shared experiences. If you haven't already, subscribe to see more stories of resilience and justice served. Like this video if you believe that sometimes life's cruelest moments can lead to our greatest transformations. And share with someone who might need to be reminded of their own value today. Thank you for being part of this community where we transform pain into power, one story at a time.